The strange thing about US China rivalry is that, at least in the reform era, it did not begin with rivalry. It began with normalization, or a repair, really. By December 1978, the earlier opening between Washington and Beijing had become formal. On December 15th in Washington, December 16th in Beijing, the United States and China announced that they would establish diplomatic relations as of January 1st, 1979. Just days later, from December 18th to 22nd, China held the third plenum of the 11th Central Committee, the meeting usually seen as the start of reform and opening up. So the timing is striking. China's reform era began almost at the same moment as the normalization of US China relations. And there is a small but interesting story behind that repair. Pakistan helped open the secret channel. In 1971, Henry Kissinger secretly traveled from Islamabad to Beijing, preparing the path for Nixon's China visit and eventually the normalization of US China relations. That detail feels relevant now because Pakistan is again appearing in the background of a major American confrontation, this time around the US Iran conflict. Different crisis, different world, but an interesting diplomatic echo. And less than a month after formal diplomatic relations began, Deng Xiaoping visited the United States. He met Jimmy Carter. He visited American cities, factories, and institutions. It was not just a ceremonial visit, it was a signal that China was ready to open the door to economic cooperation and enter a new relationship with the global economy. So the beginning of reform and opening up was also the beginning of a new US China relationship. We often talk about US China relations today as if rivalry was always the natural condition. Well, it was not. At least in the reform era, this relationship began with learning, opening, cooperation, misunderstanding, dependence, and only later, a much sharper form of competition. So I do not want to start with the question, why are China and America rivals now? I want to start one step earlier. How did a relationship that began with repair become a relationship defined by strategic rivalry? To answer that, you have to look at how Americans tried to understand China. One important starting point is the tradition associated with John King Fairbank. Fairbank's broader work, and especially the documentary volume he co-edited with Teng Su Yu, China's Response to the West, helped popularize what later became known as the Impact Response Framework. The basic idea is simple. The West shocks China, and China responds. Western ships arrive, China responds. Western technology arrives, China responds. Western institutions arrive, China responds. In this view, modern China is understood as a response to external pressure, especially pressure from the West. In my own shorthand, I think of it almost like two people in a boxing ring. One fighter keeps getting hit. If he survives, he learns, he adjusts, he changes his stance, he changes his rhythm, and after many rounds, the assumption is that the fighter who was hit again and again starts to look more like the opponent he was forced to respond to. For a long time, that was one of the American stories about China. China would modernize, and modernization would make China more like the West. And if China became more like the West, maybe the problem would solve itself. There was a quiet hope underneath this, modernization as convergence. But that hope was too simple. Kenneth Pomeranz gives you another way to think about it. In The Great Divergence, China, Europe, and the making of the modern world economy, he is not simply asking how China responded to the West. He asks why some of the most developed parts of China and Western Europe, which may have been more similar before the Industrial Revolution than older narratives assumed, diverged afterward. Now you're asking something different. You are no longer just asking how did China respond to the West. You are asking, why do different societies facing the same broad technological transformation not end up in the same place? Pomeranz is not making a simple civilizational argument. His explanation has a lot to do with material conditions: coal, ecological pressure, land constraints, overseas resources, and the way regional economies connected to global trade. What I take from Pomeranz here is not just the book's argument, it is the mistake the book helps us avoid. The lazy assumption is that modernization has one path. A society gets richer, more industrial, more connected to global markets, and eventually it becomes more like the West. But what if that is wrong? What if modernization does not produce convergence? And what if it produces a much stronger China, but not a more Western China? For American policymakers, that is the uncomfortable lesson. Modernization did not produce the political convergence many people expected, and that question is still sitting underneath a lot of US China tension today. Then there is Ronald Coase, the Nobel Prize winning economist, later co authored How China Became Capitalist with Ning Wang. What I find interesting about that book is that it does not treat China's reform as one grand blueprint. Coase and Wang basically say, do not imagine China's reform as a clean top down plan to build capitalism. A lot of it came from the edges: villages, townships, local officials, private entrepreneurs, experimental zones, people testing what the old system would tolerate. China did not simply copy a Western economic textbook. It did not privatize everything overnight. It did not become capitalist through one clean ideological program. So, in Coase's telling, China's rise is less like a perfectly designed machine and more like a chain of unexpected results. So, the old story has to change again. China was not simply responding to the West, and China was not simply converging with the West, it was also improvising. Then there is Henry Kissinger. In his book on China and in his later comments on US China relations, Kissinger kept coming back to one basic fear: America and China can dislike each other, distrust each other, pressure each other, and still stay inside politics, but they cannot start shooting. That is the line. Once the drones and missiles start flying, you are no longer managing rivalry. You are looking for off ramps while trying not to look like you chickened out. I still remember something one of my professors said when I was studying international politics in college. He said, US China relations are like a bad marriage. Both sides keep yelling, breaking dishes, threatening to leave, and somehow they stay married anyway. It sounds funny, but the point is serious. The relationship can be ugly, it can be exhausting, it can be full of suspicion, bargaining, anger, and performance. But the two sides are too entangled to simply walk away from each other. The cost of a real break is enormous. That is why Kissinger's point still matters. The problem is not whether the relationship will be tense, it will be tense. The problem is whether the tension stays inside politics or crosses into war. Put these people together, and you can see America changing its story about China. At first, China was the country reacting to Western impact. Later, it became the country many Americans hoped would converge with the West. Then China's reform made the textbook look too neat. Then it became a great power that had to be managed. And now, in Washington's language, it is the strategic competitor. What interests me is not just what these scholars said, it is how America's imagination of China kept changing. The relationship did not become tense simply because people changed their minds. The material balance changed. China is no longer the China of 1949. It is no longer the China of 1978, poor, relatively isolated, and still trying to enter the global economy. China is now the world's largest manufacturer, the world's largest auto producer, one of the largest trading nations, and the world's second largest economy. When power changes, relationships change. That is why US China relations have gone through several major rounds of confrontation. One round was the trade war during Trump's first term, another was the technology war under Biden, the Chips and Science Act. export controls on high-end chips, restrictions around semiconductor equipment, and pressure on the supply chain behind advanced computing. Then came more tariff fights. Will there be more? Probably. And I would go one step further. I think the next 10 years of US China competition will be harsher than the last 10. This is where Trump becomes interesting. I know a lot of people dislike his style. Allies dislike it, markets dislike it, diplomats dislike it. It creates uncertainty, cost, and chaos. I understand all of that. But in the US China rivalry, that unpredictability is not automatically a weakness. It tells Beijing that it is dealing with a different kind of America. Not the America that always tries to sound like a gentleman, not the America that wraps every threat in institutional language and diplomatic manners. This is an America that is more willing to show its fist. We can see that in the way Trump has used military pressure around Venezuela and Iran. Whether you like it or not, the message is hard to ignore. This White House is more willing to cross lines that previous administrations tried very hard not to cross. And for an authoritarian regime like the CCP, this is the kind of signal it may hate but cannot ignore. Authoritarian systems are very good at reading hesitation. They are also very good at sensing when a threat is only a bluff. They test your red lines. They ask again and again, is this only rhetoric or will the other side actually move? Trump's style makes that calculation harder. And I have to admit, this is risky. It can alienate allies. It can create blowback. It can make escalation harder to control. I am not romanticizing it. But if the next decade of US China competition is going to be more brutal, more transactional, more openly coercive, then maybe it takes someone like Trump, someone who does not behave like a normal diplomatic actor, to make Beijing believe that America is no longer playing the old polite game. That may be uncomfortable, but it may also be part of the deterrence, and that is why the rivalry will not stay in one lane. It spreads into almost everything that can become leverage: trade, chips, tariffs, fentanyl, rare earths, AI standards, energy routes, military posture in the Asia Pacific, and who gets to define the region's future. Energy is already one front. Look at the Russia-Ukraine war. Look at the Strait of Hormuz and the struggle around oil routes, pricing power, and control. Look at Venezuela and other countries connected to China's energy security. Russia, Iran, and Venezuela together account for a large and politically sensitive share of China's crude imports, roughly one-third by some recent estimates, though exact shares vary by year and data source. So, energy is not just an economic issue, it is a strategic vulnerability. Finance is another, sanctions, asset freezes, payment systems, dollar dependence, attempts to reduce dollar exposure. These are not small technical issues, they are part of the structure of power. And then the rivalry moves into quieter places: universities, labs, visas, hiring, sensitive research fields, corporate leadership, and talent itself becomes part of the security conversation. Exact admissions numbers are hard to interpret, and I would not reduce the story to one headline about one school. But the direction is clear. US China competition is touching universities, visas, labs, sensitive research fields, and talent flows. At the company level, you also hear stories, some confirmed, many harder to verify, about Chinese born or China linked technical staff being moved away from sensitive roles. But they fit a broader pattern. People are no longer just workers or researchers. In a strategic rivalry, they become part of the national security picture. And yet, the irony is obvious. In many labs and R&D teams, Chinese and Chinese American researchers are still everywhere because there is no easy replacement. China has built not only a hardware supply chain, but a talent supply chain. Components, factories, engineers, applied researchers, manufacturing workers, technical managers, all of this forms a huge system. From Washington's point of view, that is not just economic capacity, It is part of what makes China hard to pressure. This is why the US China relationship becomes hard to describe in one clean word. A small market example: Chinese solar shares jumped after reports that Musk linked delegations had visited photovoltaic suppliers in China. Some companies denied concrete cooperation, and the market reaction may have been speculative, but the psychology is revealing. Whether the deal is real or not, the market made the connection instantly. Future energy ambition, Chinese solar capacity. That little reaction tells you something. The two countries can be fighting over chips, security, and supply chains, while markets still immediately look to China when someone imagines a future energy project. So we are not talking about one battlefield anymore. The rivalry keeps leaking into new places: energy, finance, chips, universities, talent, even solar supply chains. But geopolitics is only half of the story. The other half is the technology itself. In 1980, Alvin Toffler published The Third Wave. His idea was that human civilization had moved through several great waves. The first wave was agriculture, the second wave was industrial civilization. The third wave was the information revolution. Toffler believed the industrial wave had reached a historical limit and that a new information based civilization was emerging. Today, I think we are standing at another point, a fourth wave, the AI wave. And if you look at the most advanced AI companies in the United States, China, and the rest of the world, I think two things will become very obvious, especially at the micro level, at the level of industries, companies, and individuals. First, the biggest users of AI may not be the AI labs themselves. They may be ordinary manufacturing companies. This is the part people miss. The AI story is not only happening inside companies building humanoid robots or foundation models, it is going to happen in the kitchenware factory, the toilet factory, the refrigerator factory, the tile factory, the soy sauce factory, the furniture factory, the building materials company. That is where AI becomes real. When AI enters production lines, when AI changes procurement, design, logistics, customer service, and management, that is where productivity actually moves. Second, AI is going to matter most in the hands of ordinary professionals. The important question is not only whether AI can produce a spectacular demo. The important question is how much it changes the everyday work of engineers, designers, salespeople, lawyers, teachers, doctors, journalists, factory managers, and small business owners. That is where you actually feel the impact. So when we talk about AI, I do not think we should only ask whether it helps us buy a cup of coffee more easily or whether it creates a cool app. I want to know whether it improves how we produce, sell, manage, learn, design, and solve problems. If it does, then the story is not just destruction, it can also give us leverage. But there is a condition: you have to be among the first people in your field to use it. If you are the last person to use it, you will probably be eliminated. Not by AI directly, but by your peers who used AI before you did. AI may not take your job, instead, someone using AI may take your job. And that is the part people might often miss. And the technology is moving incredibly fast. For instance, let's take a look at humanoid robots. The robots we saw last year and the robots we see this year are not the same thing. Not long ago, many Chinese humanoid robots were still struggling with stable walking. Now the conversation has moved to running, endurance, sprinting, boxing, balance, reaction speed, power output, shock absorption, sensors, and control algorithms. In 2026, a humanoid robot in Beijing's E-Town Half Marathon completed 21 kilometers in 50 minutes and 26 seconds, faster than the human half marathon world record. I do not want to overstate this. These races have special conditions, and they are not the same as humans competing under standard rules. But that is not the main point. The main point is speed of iteration. A machine that struggled to walk yesterday is now being discussed in terms of endurance, sprinting, and boxing. There are also reports of Unitree H1 reaching about 10 meters per second in a sprint demonstration, close to elite human sprinting speed. though not the same as beating Usain Bolt under standardized race conditions. Long distance running and sprinting are different engineering problems. Endurance, energy efficiency, heat management on one side, explosive power, impact control, sensors, and algorithms on the other. And now companies are even talking about robot boxing, which sounds like entertainment, but underneath it is a serious test of balance, reaction time, impact resistance, vision, and control. The pace of iteration is unbelievable. This is not a 10-year cycle anymore. It is quarterly, sometimes monthly. It feels as if every month may bring another globally visible demo or product, another system that forces people to update their assumptions. So, this is not a time to sleepwalk. This is a time to keep your eyes open. And this fourth wave will not only affect industries, companies, and individuals, it will also change the structure of organizations. For a long time, most organizations looked like pyramids. There were many people at the bottom, a thick layer of middle managers, and a smaller decision making group at the top. A few years ago, around the ChatGPT moment, I said that the organization of the future may look less like a pyramid and more like a diamond. What does that mean? Well, I would say the middle layer will shrink. Powerful tools start to cut through the old hierarchy. Data becomes more centralized. Decision support becomes more automated. The old function of many middle managers, passing information upward, translating instructions downward, monitoring execution, coordinating between layers, becomes less valuable. There will still be frontline people doing the work, and there will still be a decision-making layer at the top. But the thick middle of the pyramid may get carved away. Fewer people will sit in offices with little value added. People will have to move closer to the front line, closer to customers, closer to products, closer to the sound of the guns. They will need to be closer to real problems. In that kind of company, middle-level employees cannot just survive by moving information up and down the hierarchy. So the organization itself starts to change shape. Now think about our children and the next generation. After all this, what really matters for them? In the last episode, the hardest skill to replace in the age of AI, I talked about 4 abilities that matter in this new world: asking the real question, learning the tools first, breaking down the wall between the humanities and the sciences, and rebuilding professional skills around AI. If you want a deeper discussion of those 4 abilities, you can go back and watch that episode. But if I had to compress all of that into 2 things, I would say this. First, can you stay genuinely curious about the world? And second, can you ask a good question about the world? Those 2 things matter more than people think. Everything else is tool use, and tools change. The important thing is whether we can keep looking, keep learning, keep asking, and keep rebuilding ourselves. So when we talk about US China competition in the age of AI, especially at the level of industries, companies, and individuals, the question is not only whose models are bigger or whose chips are faster. I would ask it another way. Who adapts faster? Who learns faster? Who uses the tool first? Who asks better questions? And that may be the real competition. Last but not least, thank you for your interest in Journey of Societal Dynamics. This channel is my way of making sense of how people, power, and technology shape the world we live in, and how we adapt when that world changes. If this episode gave you a different way to think about US China relations, AI, technological change, or the future of work, subscribe, like, and leave a comment. And I want to leave you with 2 questions. In the age of AI and US China competition, who do you think adapts faster, countries, companies, or individuals? And more personally, are you already using AI as a tool in your own field, or are you still waiting to see what happens? Let me know in the comments, and I will see you in the next one.